Good morning, everyone. We are going to give just a second to let everybody have a chance to join our webinar, and then we will get started today. Okay, welcome everyone. I am Hannah Chapman. I am the Theodore Romanoff Assistant Professor of Russian Studies and Assistant Professor of International and Area Studies here at the University of Oklahoma. And today I have the very distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Yuval Weber, who is, in my opinion, one of the most insightful commentators on the issues of Russian security today. So we are absolutely thrilled to have him out. Dr. Weber is a research assistant professor at Texas A&M's Bush School of Government and Public Service in Washington, D.C. He also serves as a distinguished fellow at the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare at the Marine Corps University in Quantico, where he is the university's subject matter expert on Russian military and political strategy. And just a little plug, the Krulak Center has a fantastic YouTube webpage where they have really excellent videos. Dr. Weber is a frequent commentator in those, talking about the most recent things going on in the Russia-Ukraine war. So if you have a chance, do check it out. So Dr. Weber has published in a range of issues dealing with security, political, and economic topics in Russia and Eurasia, and far-reaching locations such as academic journals, but also in popular presses in both the United States and Russia, and has actually even testified before the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee. So today he's going to be speaking with us on the topic of Russian power after NATO expansion. Dr. Weber is going to be speaking for about 35 to 45 minutes, and then we will have some time for Q&A. I'll be moderating the Q&A discussion, so if at any point you have a question during the presentation, just please click on the Q&A button down at the bottom of your Zoom screen and submit your question to our speaker. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Weber. Thank you so much for coming today.
So, Dr. Chapman, it is my pleasure, and it's my pleasure to be with all of you and to have your time. So let me very quickly and efficiently share my screen, bring up the slideshow. Okay, so thank you, one and all. My contact information is there in case you have any questions afterwards. And so long as Twitter still exists, please follow me at Yuval Weber there. And additionally, if anyone is interested in this brief, in this PowerPoint slide deck, I will email a copy to Dr. Chapman. So feel free, either you can contact me, contact her. But it really is Hannah, if we may use first names, is a dear friend. So very happy to be invited by her. So where I wanted to start and really sort of think about what we're looking at, and are you guys viewing the presenter style?
Yes.
Okay. Wait, so are you looking at two slides at once or just one?
Two slides. Okay,
let's see if how do I swap displays? Okay, that should be a little more presentation ready. I was thinking, man, this is going to be like really easy, but of course, things intervene. So what I wanted to do with today is really to start here looking at these two pictures, because obviously when we're thinking about NATO power, Russian power after NATO expansion, we have basically one assumption: NATO's expanding. That is a pretty safe assumption, but it's not yet official. But what we can understand is that going forward, Russia, after this war is over, is going to have less influence worldwide, less power, both inside its own country and abroad, and is going to be much angrier and have far greater resentments and grievances towards the international system than before. And so really, when we think about what does grievance in its starting position looks like, I took this picture of Vladimir Putin on the left because what he's talking about, like from this screenshot, is this is the speech that is announcing that the recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics is forthcoming. The special military operation would begin the next day, and the body language here, and really sort of when I look at this picture, and I was thinking about this as I was watching it in real time, is if you've ever had like a father or grandfather or uncle who's talking at you at the Thanksgiving table, whether you've opted into that conversation or not, that's the energy that Putin is giving off. He's saying Ukraine doesn't exist and it doesn't matter anyways. And really the sort of matter of fact, the position of ultimate confidence that he's about to revise international relations, he's about to break Ukraine in half, he's about to make Russia a great power that nobody can deny. That's what he's talking about in that picture on the left. And when we then look at the people on the right, and this goes central into Russian power, those two people, the woman in the back is Elvira Nabiulna. She's the head of Russia's central bank. And in the foreground is the President Putin's special economic advisor and previously a minister of economic development. The guy on the left, Putin, he's talking about Russian power writ large, but those two people are going to have to figure out how to pay for it. And when we think about Russian power, a lot of people, when they think about it, they think about what are security interests, what are the national security interests that a country may have, how does it conflict or work with the security interests of others. But what I want to introduce over the course of this talk is to think about how does power work in Russia? What is basically going to happen at the conclusion of this conflict? And then to think, whatever happens because of this conflict, how is Russia going to pay for its defense posture going forward? And when you think about, all the fights that any country has, part of it is, well, who's going to pay for it? These two people, those are two of the most responsible people like in Russia. And as you can tell, their vibes are extremely off at the moment. So what I wanted to talk about, for the next half hour or so is basically three questions. What is Russia's political culture and its recent political history? In essence, how does power hang together in Russia? And what can we expect out of Russia after this war is over? Second is what did Putin want out of this war? Why was it so badly planned? And that really gets into the questions of not just force structure, but thinking what's happening in the field, what's going to happen in the field after the war's over. And then finally, how might Russia develop following this conflict? And that's where we really get into what has, NATO writ large, what has it announced in terms of expansion to Finland and Sweden? What do we see out of NATO battle groups that are now across Ukraine and Russia? And then to think, and this is for those of you who are undergraduates, and you're thinking, might I have a career in the military or elsewhere in the national security space? We'll talk about the Black Sea and the High North, like the Arctic areas, because those in essence are quote unquote growth areas for US national security interests going forward, because those are the places where Russia is going to be the most active. And if you read things like national security strategies, national defense strategies, they talk about what is it that the US wants to do and how do policymakers view the threats that are basically besetting the United States. If you understand what are the security threats that are challenging like Russia and China, you'll have a head start on sort of like figuring out how you might make this a career. So if at any point people have any questions, comments, please just let me know. And I will do my very best to figure that out. So bottom line up front, these are all the points that we'll be talking about. And again, this deck is available for those who are interested. So prior to 2022, Putin was very successful as a Russian leader. And whatever we think about Putin, he's very good at Russian politics. Just keep that in mind. It's a difficult country. He's been in charge for about 22 years, and at this point, still counting. Because instead of trying to optimize growth or trying to do any specific policy outcome, by optimizing for stability and resilience, he's made himself an indispensable leader for Russia's elite. And that's important to understand how power works in Russia, and then how power might evolve over the course of this conflict, post-conflict, and until the end of Putin's natural life. Russia's foreign policy that Putin has defined and leveraged is that the United States took advantage of Russia at a really weak position at the conclusion of the Soviet Union in 1991, instead of starting the international order when the Soviet Union was still in a position of power in 1989 at the conclusion of the Cold War. And I'll talk more about that, and I'll talk more about all these points, but to have this understanding of what does Russia want versus what does Russia have, how that motivates Russia's grand strategy, and how that'll change after this war is basically like at least a good 80% of my job. I lived in Russia for about 4.5 years, wonderful and insane experiences all the time, but that's basically how I understand my job in terms of understanding and interpreting Russia. Russia's foreign policy expansionism over roughly the last 15 years was meant to challenge the US international order and to demonstrate great power status, and to demonstrate to the United States and others that Russia matters, that Russia cannot be ignored or excluded from international affairs. The paradox is that Russia wanted to be recognized as a global power, but achieved success as a regional power. And even that is now under stress because of the just the bad conduct of the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war was meant to be the breakthrough to true great power status, and post-war Russia will be a much more brutal place than before for domestic and economic reasons. But, and this is really like, where you guys were interested, is because NATO is going to continue to expand, not just in terms of new members, but new capabilities. And the amount of, quote unquote, Europe, where Russia has to project its influence, is declining day by day. The more Ukraine reconquers territory, the less able Russia is to alter the European and international security architecture. And that's the thing that is burning up Russia's foreign policy elite on a daily basis. And to the extent that you guys, follow sort of Russia, even through English language sources, you'll note the energy is not good. And it's been bad for a while, and it's only going to get worse. And that's because the war is going poorly, and NATO keeps getting stronger because Russia keeps getting weaker. And that is going to be the next generation of Russia. And obviously, what is in the picture on the left, myself and a co-author, we were quoted by the New York Times Magazine in terms of understanding the source of Russia's grievances. So part one, and this is really sort of like, just to make sure we're on the same page when thinking about Russia. We often have an image of Russian leaders as being something like the one strong man by himself. And Russia's only had 2 female leaders, but only Catherine the Great was a big one. She did very well. That's why she has the great, appended to her name. But when we think about Russian leaders, we think about just one person, one strong man. He points, subordinates scurry, somebody gets poisoned, like that sort of thing. But how I want to think about like Russian power and Russian foreign policy and grand strategy is to refer to basically what you see on the picture on the right. Putin is not a person who invaded Ukraine by himself in terms of holding the gun and running at the Ukrainians in Ukraine. He commands a political system that relies on something very different, which is commanding the loyalty of Russia's elite. And Russia's elite, and this is from his 2018 inauguration on the right, is small enough that it more or less fits in one very nice room. And this is one of the inside the Kremlin that you may have heard of. The Kremlin Kreml, the word in Russian, just means fort. So if you think of a big fort, there are various palaces and cathedrals inside. So this is just one of the really nice ones. And so for this event, all the people who matter in some significant way to the way that Putin can hold onto power, and not hold on to power in terms of, controlling the state through the bureaucracy, which we'll talk about in a moment, but making sure all the powerful people of Russia are more or less balanced. That's in essence the thing that Putin has done very well over his career, and that makes him indispensable to the Russian elite. If you think about this as, when we think about, like, let's say crime families, like mafia gangsters, like all that, the key thing that the Godfather does is making sure everyone stays in their lane. And that's the core thing that Putin has been really good at, is making sure all of those people in the room, in the picture on the right, and by the way, just in terms of like just the absolute weirdos who like show up to Russia these days, front center is obviously like the patriarch of like the Russian Orthodox Church. To our right is the former leader of Germany. And if you basically like pan towards the right, you'll see a lady in a white dress, then you'll see another lady in a blue dress. And then if you look over her left shoulder to our right, you'll also see Steven Seagal, former action movie star of Hollywood of the 80s and 90s. All those people basically want more, but who is able to basically say when they can have more and when they need to hold off? Having that ability to balance otherwise very aggressive, very greedy people, that's the thing that Putin's been able to do. So when we think about Putin, we don't always have to think about, the one strong man, but we think about Putin as a really good politician, a really good balancer of all the people who want more at the expense of others. And if they got more at the expense of others, well, then someone's going to be upset. And if someone's upset, that's how you start to get the behind the scenes fighting. So when we think about Russian leadership intentions, and for those of you who are going into a career in national security, whether it's in the defense enterprise or you're going to the intelligence community, leadership intentions is one of the most important phrases that you can learn, because you'll always be asked, what is Putin thinking? What is Xi Jinping thinking? If we did this, how would, Macron of France react? You're then trying to understand what is the culture behind them and behind these leaders in terms of strategic culture, in terms of political culture, so that when basically a policy is put forth, how can you anticipate the behavior of others? So that's an important part of, the being in DC and in working in this space. So when we think about Russian leadership intentions, the core job requirement is balancing between imposing order on the state and achieving balance within the elite. Putin, because he's very good at his job, and still there's no challengers to Putin, even after 9 months of a truly bad war, he optimizes resilience and stability over all else. He's already served longer than Stalin, and if he makes it to the end of his current terms as set by the Russian Constitution, which he changed to allow himself more time, he will end up as the third longest ruler of Russia of all time. Literally, and I'll show you the picture in just a second, since only Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great will have served longer if Putin makes it to 2036. And the reason that Putin's been able to do this is that domestic politics of Russia are devoted to three objectives: keeping the high-level supporters happy and not killing each other, ensuring the public maintains a high level of patriotism to avoid turning against the system because of the bad economy, because you can't eat great power status, and hoping that the US and Europe lose enthusiasm for supporting Ukraine and maintaining the current sanctions policy, and that China helps bring about a multipolar order that makes Russia more important relative to others. And just to give you a visual demonstration, in the middle there with the star at the top would be Putin, the star in the middle is Peter the Great, and the star at the bottom is Ivan the Terrible. And when we're thinking about Ivan the Terrible, we are now going back into like 14th, 15th centuries of rule. That's how long Putin at this point could last. Just throwing that out there. And so again, when we think about how to practice power in Russia, we have the image of the guy on the left, but we also have the image of what happens on the right. And so for those of you who haven't seen it, this is a movie still from The Death of Stalin, which I said 80% of Russia is trying to understand like its grievances. The other 20% is basically you watch this movie, you'll get it. Because in this scene, like we have Stalin, he's dead. He's on the floor. The movie opens Death of Stalin, so no spoilers here. And when you watch the movie, if you haven't seen already, basically this one strong guy is ruling over all of them with an iron fist. He dies. What happens if you have a system in which there's one strong guy? Well, all of them don't know who they want to be the next leader, except they know the guy who's sitting, Lavrentiy Beria, is like super violent, and if he gains power, he's probably going to kill them all. So they only know that the guy basically in the sort of light green suit in the middle, he's the formal leader, but he doesn't have any informal power. So they only know that he's basically the boss right now, but he's totally weak. And the guy who's sitting down doesn't have any formal power, but he's got the secret services behind him. So he can kill all of them. And so the movie goes from strongman to stable collective leadership to then unstable collective leadership. And eventually one man emerges out of all of these. And that's basically the other part of how Russia works. Putin imposes order on the state vertically by having mutual accountability and reciprocity, so that the boss as Putin has people that report to him, and they have people that report to them, and they have people, and so on and so forth, until you get to like the lowest public servant, the lowest bureaucrat in the dustiest village and the back end of beyond in Siberia. That person thinks to him or herself, well, I have a boss, and he has a boss, and she has a boss, and eventually you get all the way back up to Putin. So that basically from Putin to the other end of power, everyone believes they're all into the same line, going up and down vertically. This is what the Russians call the vertical of power. But additionally, what Putin has is the ability to balance everybody else. So he imposes discipline on the state through the bureaucracy, ensures the public maintains high level of patriotism, eliminates alternatives. That's how he's able to keep the up and down power going. But in terms of the horizontal power, making sure everyone's happy and not killing each other. And those are two very different things. Getting to the contemporary times, we'll start to move in, but the Iron Tsars, the people who can do power vertically, they can get power, but you need to basically have a different job skill in order to hold on to power. And an example that I think you may have talked about earlier in your class, when thinking about the 1990s in Russia, the picture on the bottom, this is Boris Yeltsin, Putin's predecessor, who faced down a coup in August 1991, rushed to the symbol of the Soviet people, the then Soviet parliament, and faced down like the army and these like hardliners trying to take over power. So he defended a building that after he then gained power, brought the Soviet Union to an end, he was then the president of Russia. And over the course of about 2 years, and roughly 2+ years later from the picture on the bottom, he could not get along with his parliament. And it got to the point where the parliament tried to remove Yeltsin from power. And he responded by ordering the same army that he stood against in August 1991. He then ordered that army in October 1993 to fire on that same building, using more violence than the people he faced down. And so once that was done, it was clear what the limits of his power were. Not formally, the Constitution changes that, but, he's still the president. But in terms of everyone knew, this guy doesn't know how to get what he wants without violence. Therefore, he's not good at working with people. And so Yeltsin failed to consolidate either democracy or authoritarianism because he didn't have both types of job skills, getting power, maintaining it. And so, how has Putin ruled for so long? We have that all there. And then, of course, and this, pardon me, this is a little bit out of order, but sorry, this is like very unprofessional of me, but I totally got the order wrong. And what basically Putin was able to do relative to Yeltsin is that he was able to end political competition. He made the Russian state the primary economic actor, which means that he was able to pick and choose. He's able to pick and choose who are the winners and losers in the Russian economy. And so if he's able to pick and choose who are the winners in the Russian economy, then everyone needs to be very nice to him because he controls the access to the state budget. So he ended the independent power of all the different people who were then, basically getting theirs out of Yeltsin, his predecessor, who's in the picture here on the right. He ended the independent power of the oligarchs, the Chechens, the governors, people who were powerful during the 1990s. He eliminated them one by one. And then in terms of great power, conflict, and confrontation, it's where we start to see the grievances that Putin was able to leverage over his time at the beginning several terms that he had. And this comes from what the Russians expected to inherit when the Soviet Union came to an end versus what they actually did. In 1989, at the conclusion of the Cold War, when the Berlin Wall is coming down, when it's clear that a lot of countries in Europe do not want socialism, do not want a close relationship with the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, who's there on the left, in the middle, he is signing the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty with then President Ronald Reagan. This is in 1987. And as Europe is changing dramatically in 1989, he is there pictured with George H.W. Bush building a new world. And the view that the Soviets had at that time and the view that the Americans had is that this is going to be a very exciting and positive, generation or era in international relations, because the Soviet Union is peacefully ending the Cold War. And as basically the Soviet Union has all of these client states across Eastern Central Europe, like Czechoslovakia, which no longer exists, but Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, etc. All these countries are throwing off socialist governments. And HW and Gorbachev meet in Malta, 1989. And basically HW asks them, Bulgaria is one thing, Romania is another, but the Soviet Union has its entire forward presence in Europe, in East Germany and East Berlin. Are you going to allow Germany to reunify if that's what they want? Are you going to are you going to use the Red Army, like the Soviet army, to basically hold on to power there? And Gorbachev then says, every state will find its own way to socialism. I'm not going to use the Red Army against anybody. And HW then understands no Soviet leader who's insincere about pursuing domestic economic reforms would give up East Germany, would give up the crown jewel of Soviet security. And in that, Bush understood that he was a very sincere leader. And basically, Bush was himself looking forward to a new era of cooperation with the Soviet Union. And what the Soviets expected at that point was ending the Cold War, jointly governing international affairs with the United States, because even if US is number one, Soviet Union is number two, the distance between 2 and 3 is so great that it's still going to be a bipolar, like in thinking about how does the world work, just 2 major states defining the international system. There'd be a series of neutral buffer states on the European border, less need for cultivating allies and clients elsewhere, and that he'd have this opportunity with the benign international environment to reboot the domestic economy and political life. But things don't work out as intended. What we're seeing here is that the big picture on the right, the Time magazine cover, is that as the Soviet Union gave up its external empire in Eastern and Central Europe, a lot of other republics within the Soviet Union said, hey, wait a second, we just happened to be conquered by the Russians, not in the 1940s, but maybe earlier in the century, maybe in the previous century, but we're also not Russian people. Like, we want to be free in the same way that Hungarians are. And so Lithuanians, Georgians, people from across the Soviet Union start to put a lot of pressure on the Soviet state itself. And the person who brings the Soviet Union to an end is actually not from one of these republics, but it's the guy in the middle, Boris Yeltsin. And his key argument is that the Soviet Union is actually bad for Russians. And what Russia needs is its own country. And so what we see there on the bottom is that, technically speaking, the guy on the right, Yeltsin, is a subordinate to the guy on the left, Gorbachev, but he's sticking his finger in Gorbachev's face and on live national television. So just imagine in class, walking up to Professor Chapman and just sticking your finger in her face and telling her the business. It's not going to end well. Just imagine if it was now on national news. Again, your university president, not going to take that kindly, but that's what's happening. And what we see there in the middle picture is that Yeltsin and his colleagues from Belarus and Ukraine pulling their republics out of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union thus came to an end. And so as the Soviet Union came to an end, we have two things that basically Putin has talked about for the last 20 plus years. And this is where we really get to what is the point of the Ukraine war. They wanted to rule the world with the United States. What they got was poverty at home and the loss of the feeling of being a superpower, the expansion of NATO. All of these things happened simultaneously. So the NATO expansion started in Central Europe and set the precedent for all others. If you want to join the European Union, if you want to join NATO, basically it all starts in East Germany. East Germany ceases to exist by just taking the institutions, taking the laws, taking the flag, taking everything of West Germany. That seems to work. And that's what basically NATO and EU accession are today. It's not a merger of equals. It's basically the lawyers come from NATO or the lawyers come from Brussels, from the EU, and just change all of your laws. They change your political institutions. And what you get for it is access to the entire common market of Europe, the ability to live, work, travel freely. And that at its core is the thing that this war is about, and what Russia has to think about when this war is over. If Europe basically extends to Russia's borders, the threat to Russia that it presents is that other states have been given the choice of whether they want to be in Russia's sphere of influence or not. And the answer that they opted for was or not. And that if they can live happy, healthy European lives, what does that say about the way that Russian power can be practiced at home? Europe is this supranational federation. It pools its sovereignty. It shares power. It shares institutions. The Russian power that I described a little while ago is literally the exact opposite of that, where power is centralized in one person. And so that's what this war is about. Is power just one person effectively on a modern throne, or is power this messy thing that happens amongst lots of countries at once? And what Putin has been saying to his domestic population is that if we lose in Ukraine and just writ large, we will have the indignity of not being able to rule ourselves. And we would rather be poorer, we would rather be, less well off, but to have our dignity. We'd rather be a first-rate us than be a second-rate European power. And that at the core is what this conflict is about. And so when we then think about what are the ways in which Putin has tried to articulate Russia being an independent power in international affairs. He attempted to bandwagon, attempted to work with the United States after 9/11. That went nowhere. Attempted to become a European power by trying to work with France and Germany to stop the Iraq War in 2003. That didn't work. Attempted to create a new political order through either BRICS, which is a grouping with Brazil, India, China, and South Africa. That didn't really get off the ground. The Eurasian Economic Union, of which Ukraine is the key piece, that he either needs all of Ukraine or at least half of it, in order to deny Ukraine to Europe, but also to get its resources and its basically position in Europe. That also hasn't really done very much. And that if none of those things work, then what else can be done? And that's where we've started to see the use of violence abroad in order to create a greater expanse of Russian influence. Intervention abroad, Georgia 2008, Crimea 2014, Syria 2015, and over the last 4 or 5 years, all across North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. Part of that is to make a political narrative that Russia's back and the US is on the decline. Because if the US were not on the decline, why wouldn't they stop all of these things that Russia's doing? That sort of circular logic. And so that's how we get to this war. Putin wanting to rule basically indefinitely at home, not just in his person, but even after he's gone, trying to withstand the pressure of NATO and EU of forming plausible, positive alternatives. And if he can't get it through economic inducements, because Russia is not as wealthy as the EU, or being able to provide security to neighboring states, because NATO definitely invades, has not yet invaded any of its own members, or let its own members be invaded without answering, which is something that's happened to both Kyrgyz Republic as well as Armenia, is that if he can't get it through peace and security and markets, what he can do is try to change political realities through conflict. And this is where his buddy Alexander Lukashenko, in this picture for the Russian nerds in the crowd, this is Lukashenko at the same time that Moscow, the same time as Putin, is saying there is no invasion forthcoming, even though there's nearly 200,000 Russian soldiers on Ukraine's borders. Lukashenko makes a presentation, and he's the leader of Belarus, who's been in power even longer than Putin. This is where he's explaining exactly where the invasion will happen. If any of you watched the show Veep, or you enjoyed Death of Stalin, it was one of these classic moments where one person's saying, we're not about to do a thing, and the other person goes, well, here's exactly how we're about to do the thing, on the same day. But in essence, the reason I wanted to show you a picture of this guy from Belarus is that this is what Putin wanted out of Ukraine. He didn't want to rule Ukraine on a daily basis. That was the Soviet Union. That's expensive. But to turn Ukraine into a bigger version of Belarus, which governs itself, but all of its foreign economic and security policies are either decided upon by Moscow or agreed in conjunction with Moscow. That's what Putin wanted out of Ukraine, that they don't take any policies that Putin doesn't like, but otherwise they're left to be. So if that were to happen, Putin would then have reestablished a bigger part of the Slavic core of the Russian Empire and would have revived imperialism in modern times. Success would have meant challenging, obviously, US power, Western interests, and would have started basically a new era of international relations. So the war does define the end of the post-Soviet era. It's just that in the post-Soviet era, things are not going as well. And they're not going as well because what Russia wanted out of NATO and Ukraine, or to use sort of the jargon of the day, they wanted both of them to just cancel themselves. For Ukraine, what the Russians wanted, and the guy at the right is Russia's foreign minister, they wanted Ukraine to undergo what they call denazification. Now, obviously, Nazis they're real, they're among us, they're in lots of US states, but when we think about the word in general, we think about basically Germans from 1933 to 1945. The way that Soviets, like before the Russians, the Soviets thought about the Nazis is not just like these historical Germans, but the Germans and all else and all the other people who opposed Soviet power. So since Russia has inherited basically the legacy of the Soviet Union, in Russian political parlance, anyone who is in opposition to Russian political power is a Nazi. And so all of the people who came into politics after the Euromaidan in Ukraine from 2014 to the present, those are all the people that Russia wants gone, because they know no one who came to power since then is going to be able to deliver a Ukraine that does not look out for Ukrainian national interests or defines Ukrainian national interests in terms of what Russia wants. So that's what denazification means. They also wanted Ukraine to give up any weapons that could threaten Russia and to recognize Russia taking as much of its territory as Russia felt it needed. So obviously for Ukraine to become smaller, weaker, and unindependent, to give up as much sovereignty as Russia felt was necessary to make Russia feel secure. And for the US and NATO, they also made specific demands. It needs to remove all the military infrastructure from states that were not members in 1997 when, newly post-communist states started joining, to guarantee that no new members could join NATO. And this includes Ukraine and Finland and Sweden, halt all activities in the former Soviet Union, which includes the Baltic states, but also includes countries like Turkey, helping Azerbaijan win all of its wars, and to remove all nuclear weapons from Europe. And so in this regard, what Russia wanted was to end the way that European and international security is governed, or else it would invade Ukraine. And their anticipation is that the United States and NATO and Europe simply did not care about Ukraine enough to basically run the risk of a wider conflict in order to maintain the status quo in Europe. So obviously Russia invaded, and what we can see here from left to right, left is basically 2 weeks into the conflict, and all the red, and so the blue is basically what Russia had occupied before the war. The red is basically where their presence was, roughly 2 weeks into the conflict. And what we can see on the right is effectively, as of today, where Russian forces are now. They wanted to either kill the president of Ukraine or just eliminate the political class there, encircle major cities, capture smaller towns, basically fight north from Crimea, southwest from other territories to create a land bridge to Crimea. But their special military operation was designed to last for 3 days and then start to collect surrenders for the next couple of weeks. And obviously the Ukrainians have fought back much more. And what we can see in the first few weeks, completely wrong political assumptions by the Russians, because they anticipated that, in effect, Ukraine was just a version of Russia, that no one in Ukraine was going to fight for Zelensky, the guy at the top right, because that's essentially how Russia's run. They didn't anticipate, or they didn't sort of understand that people would be fighting for their houses, like their homes, the literal as well as the metaphorical one, their language, their families, their sovereignty, their ability to be themselves. So Russia failed to destroy Ukrainian air defense and air assets because the military didn't think they're actually going to do something as ludicrous as try to invade Ukraine. They met unexpected resistance and local hostility. So therefore their operational plans did not meet their logistical needs, as we saw early in the war. So they have resorted to attacks on civilian infrastructure. The sanctions regime, and this is myself on Bloomberg, and I like this picture mainly because the chyron at the bottom there, the sanctions are beyond what anyone had anticipated. And so in terms of personal sanctions on basically Russia's entire airplane, both the ability to fly to Europe and the larger West, but also the planes themselves there are no new parts that go into Russia. So just last week, the Russian aviation regulator, like which, the FAA, like the Russian version of FAA, has now approved 3D printed parts for airplanes in Russia because they can't get new parts because their service contracts are canceled due to sanctions. So this is, of course, reducing Russia's ability to travel abroad and within their own country. Their energy pipelines are not just canceled, but also like they blew up one of them. Bank sanctions, shipping and insurance volatility. They have had to break basically the supply chains that they've built up over the last 30 years. They don't have contact with the outside banking world. Microchips don't go into Russia. So altogether, Russia's ability to grow as a modern economy has been brought to an end. And what the Europeans did at the beginning of the conflict is they froze more than $300 billion of Russian assets abroad. So when we started with those two people with their heads in their hands, whatever pre-war plans they had to basically insulate Russia's economy, Russia at that point had $600 billion in total. They then had 300. So they had half the time to figure out what's the next step. And where we are right now is Belarus has basically been sanctioned out of the modern international economy, and oil and gas exports between Europe and the United States, those are being sanctioned as well. So when it comes to Russia and Europe, and this is basically where we'll start to conclude and then have the discussion, is that 50 years of German policy, and that guy on the right there is the German chancellor. 50 years of German and European policy was, we'll try to change the Soviet Union or Russia through trade. And what that means is, we're nice to the Russians while they sell us cheap energy. That policy is now over because Russia keeps invading its neighbors. Russian energy is being decoupled from Europe as we speak. And the gas store, and obviously, like, I don't know how it is, the weather you guys in Oklahoma, but it's been unseasonably warm here in the Northeast and as well as across Europe. So the gas demand from Europe has been relatively low. And over the past 8 months, Europe has basically filled its gas storage tanks. So the energy weapon has not been something that Russia's been able to use very effectively so far. Finland and Sweden have applied for NATO membership. 29 of 30 of the countries have approved or have it on like their domestic legislative calendar. Turkey is the holdout, and basically the hands around the Turkish shoulders are getting tighter and tighter. So that seems to also be in place by the end of the year. And Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia have applied for EU membership, with Ukraine and Moldova receiving candidate status. And at the beginning of the war, Russia had said, Ukraine said, this war is about ensuring that NATO can't take Ukraine as a member and threaten us directly. So it talked about NATO expansion being the source of Russian insecurity. When Sweden and Finland said that they were going to join, this is what Putin actually had to say on the matter was, with Sweden and Finland, we don't have the problems that we have with Ukraine. They want to join NATO, go ahead. Literally no one asked him for his permission, but he was still granting it, which is exactly the sort of toxic behavior that you need to avoid in all your personal relationships, as well as what sort of leaders you choose, just straight up. But he said thereafter, but they must understand there was no threat before. Well, now if military contingents and infrastructure are deployed there, we'll have to respond in kind and create the same threats for the territories from which threats towards us are created. Again, I'm nice to you, but if you're not nice to me, I'm going to be super nasty to you. Again, toxic personal behavior in your personal lives that you should avoid at all costs. So like never start a relationship with Vladimir Putin. Like that's my number one policy advice for all of you directly. And that's the thing. And so there where we are in terms of what Russia wanted before this war is to have less NATO. What they got was more countries are going to join NATO, and there's just going to be more NATO writ large. Before this conflict, there were 4 what are called NATO battle groups. which are sort of combined air, land, sea, and space and intelligence power in 4 countries. And if we look from the top, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. In essence, basically NATO's presence in existing NATO countries that were meant to at least to deter or at least try to slow down any Russian invasion of the NATO states, the Baltic states. Since this war has began, President Biden, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO leader, like the leader of NATO, like the actual organization, as well as all the other countries of NATO, have agreed to establish and have established 4 more battle groups across southeastern Europe. And so if we look at the middle there, we see Poland, but then below that, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. There's now new thousands, tens of thousands, and even in Poland going to be like an increase of about 50,000 NATO soldiers that will just now be arrayed close to or bordering Russia. And so Putin, the strategic genius that he is in fact created a bigger and more robust NATO from his war in Ukraine. And where we can conclude here is to then say, you know, what are the big questions about Russia going forward? We can see that there's going to be basically as NATO grows and as it becomes more robust, because this is a US dominated organization, there's going to be more US power in Europe. And so for those of you who are interested in a career in like foreign policy, learning Polish, learning Ukrainian, those are going to be like good things to invest in because those are going to be where NATO is. Also, this is actually like one of the weird factoids. When you combine Finnish, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, and Icelandic, which are the main sort of Scandinavian languages, Scandinavian and regional languages, guess how many people within the larger US government can speak all of those languages combined? It's 130. And that's mainly for basically because we have like a lot of people who basically learn one of those languages. And because those languages are fairly close to each other, once they learn another language, they're counted as 2 people. So substantively, as I was told, there's roughly 75 people in US government who can competently speak 1 or more Scandinavian languages. So again, if you have a career in like the military and you learn like Norwegian, you have a job for life. Throwing this out there. Also, Norway, lovely place to go. Just again, throwing that out there as well. Remilitarization of Europe, because there's going to be a lot of basically defense spending to counter Russia, because as long as Putin's in power, and he'll be there until the end of his life, there's going to be just a lot more defense attention in Europe. China loses an ally, but gains a subordinate. What does that mean for the Russia-China relationship? And how will Russia pay for all this? The financial sanctions, export controls, curtailment of supply chains will bring forward Russia's economic collapse. At the same time that NATO is actually more active, both in the Black Sea area as well as in the high north. And then obviously inside Russia, the vibes are going to be bad for a very long time, because for a fiasco of this size, the responsible parties have to be identified. And if it's not Putin, it's going to be somebody else. And once it's somebody, well, what Putin's going to do, because it's what every Russian leader does, is say, well, who are you in cahoots with? Who else was available? And basically the purges inside government are going to take the attention for years. And that's basically the Russia that's going to be for a long time, is just a dark and violent place. And that's basically when we think about Russian power after NATO, what's happening in Russian society, what's happening in the Russian economy, and what's happening independent of Russia is going to determine the contours of what Russia power looks like after this war is over and as NATO and Europe expand. And that's where I'd like to conclude. I want to thank you for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing the slides, and let's just open it up.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that depressing but very insightful presentation. Perhaps a good question then is to start where you left off, which is you seem to predict a pretty bleak future for Russia going forward. So what do you see is what might happen in Russia if Putin were to die or to leave office? Is there a clear successor to Putin? And would you predict any type of policy changes within Russia should he leave?
Those are all great questions. I would hesitate to think that Putin is going to leave office in any other way except through the icy hand of death. Could be from someone else, but ultimately, when I think about, and this is the question that I often get, is the reason that I don't think anyone will try to remove Putin, unless like something truly, not just losing the war, not just having an economic collapse. Those are things that I think Putin could actually survive without too much difficulty. But if like he starts to order like nuclear weapons usage, like, and we're now like just different realms of like the human experience. Short of that, the reason I think Putin is going to stay in power until his natural life comes to an end, like in the same way that it all does, or like for all of us it does, is that if he's gone, who protects basically the oligarchs from the security services? Security services want the money and the assets of the oligarchs. Well, the oligarchs are often like the biggest supporters of the Russian armed services, because in case the security services come after them, they need people with guns to intervene on their behalf, which then creates all these different sort of, configurations of Russian power. So in that regard, everyone in the elite knows this war is going badly, and that Putin is driving us into a state of absolute, like, just nightmare. However, he's the only person who can hold this all together. And he's the only person who can actually take us out of it, because he's the only person that everyone can agree upon. If we remove him, the war doesn't get any better, because what could happen thereafter? Russia keeps fighting, but now they don't have the leader to basically like impose discipline at home, or they have to say, oops, sorry, we like didn't mean to invade the country. Let's take the troops out. At which point everyone in Russia is like, I lost my husband, I lost my father, for what exactly? We were humiliated by the Ukrainians, for what exactly? America's laughing at us, for what exactly? The Chinese are going to extract every bit of value from our economy in the Far East, or push us out of Central Asia, for what exactly? Which is all to say, Putin is basically the worst available leader in terms of like the empirical reality of how he's governing Russia. But he's the best leader for maintaining stability amongst the elites. Once he's gone, who protects them from the outside world, and who protects them from each other? So what I foresee, just big picture here, is that this war goes on for like another year or two. Like, so long as Russia has like literally men to kill, like literally men who are going to die, Putin doesn't matter. Like, they're just going to go into the meat grinder. And that, by the way, is actually like, Russians don't use the phrase cannon fodder, because we do have people who are meant to just like die, like in conflict. They actually use the word ground meat. And so when like Russian military leaders talk about like the mobilized people, it's just ground meat. You just throw them in there. Their job is basically to be human speed bumps for the Ukrainian advance. And so there's lots of social media videos of where people realize, like, how did I get here? The record stops, like, oh, you may be wondering, how did I get here? They're saying, oh, our commander told us to go, in this direction, but we realized we're only meant to go into an open field so that the Ukrainians would fire upon us with their artillery, so as to expose their positions so that our artillery could go after them. Literally meant to just be on a suicide mission without telling them. What is all that for? And so in that regard, they're going to keep fighting this conflict in order to see, can we basically wait out European and American / like Western resolve? So the war can go badly, Putin's not going to leave. The economy can collapse, Putin's not going to leave. Because so long as there's a credible chance that the West stops supporting Ukraine to the extent that it does, means that Russia can get to the negotiating table from a position of strength. Because even if this war has gone terribly, at least they have conquered like 15 to 20% of Ukraine. And that's basically the position of strength that they would love to have recognized at the negotiating table. So once Putin goes, it's going to be like a war of all against all. It's going to be a melee of people at each other's throats, but that's like in years, and that's for the next person to have to deal with.
Yeah. So knowing now what we know about how the Russian government operates, do you think that this war in Ukraine was foreseeable or even preventable?
Foreseeable, yes. Preventable, no. Like, all wars are preventable. It's just like, what are the costs of prevention? So in terms of prevention, if basically, like when I showed you the slides of like NATO cancels itself and Ukraine like gives up its sovereignty to Russia, that was November 2021. This crisis began in April of 2021 when Russia started amassing troops. That led to a meeting with Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin in Geneva in June 2021. At that point, they talked about strategic stability talks, which the American side thought meant talking about, arms control. But what the Russians wanted strategic stability to mean is basically the balance of power in Europe. In November 2021, Russia gave demands that were on their face like ludicrous. And so if you give demands that are ludicrous, it means that you are extremely willing to go to war. That's the war that they're fighting. So preventable, of course. It just NATO has to go out of business. Okay, sure. Ukraine has to stop being an independent country. Sure. So was this foreseeable? I would argue, given that Russia had a very clear view on what the appropriate balance of power in Europe should be, which is the Europe of 1989, is that there is a very large zone of buffer states that protects Russia, that protects basically like Russia from like NATO. Like buffer states are not neutral. They protect one side or the other. So what they wanted was basically East and Central Europe to protect Russia. And what all these countries wanted to, what these countries actually did was join NATO and the European Union. And so long as that became, in essence, the practice, you then had what, here in Washington, you call the integration dilemma. The more states that join countries for their own safety and security, like EU, NATO, the less secure that Russia feels, because every state that goes into those organizations is a vote of no confidence in Russia. So the more states that say, we will do anything to be protected from Russia, the less Russia feels secure. 1/6 of the world's mass, or 1/6 of the world's total size, yet they feel more and more insecure. That, in a way, sort of one could see that this was going to be a conflict, because either Russia has to accept that no one wants to be with it, or will redefine the definition of everyone.
So do you see this war at any point, the NATO members actually joining the war more than just they are now, with supplying Ukraine with supplies and whatnot? Do you see this as a potential scenario?
So President Biden at the outset said, NATO will not participate directly in the conflict. And he has stuck to that. NATO countries supply Ukraine to an unbelievable extent, to an extent that basically, Russia thought this was going to be like a special military operation, that this is going to be a special operation like Georgia, Ukraine, Crimea. Syria, just of increasingly larger sizes. The Russians had no idea they were actually conducting a land war against basically one of the top NATO caliber militaries. That's the war that they find themselves in. So I just like totally lost my train of thought, but like that. Sorry, what was the question? Like I just totally like just like zoned out for a second.
No worries. So do you see a scenario where NATO countries will actually get involved physically in the conflict?
No, so yeah, so sorry about that. So like we then see that NATO supplies Ukraine a lot, but they don't join in the fighting. We've also seen that Russia does not attack NATO states where those supplies, which are only meant to kill Russians, are coming through. So we can actually use this as a way, like we think about deterrence as, you know, what is actually deterrence? This is a real life example. Both sides have set something that they say, if you go beyond this line, we will do bad things to you. And both sides are respecting it. Biden's gamble at the beginning of this conflict was a NATO supplied Ukraine will be able to hold off Russia. Bold prediction or bold gamble, more or less it's paid off. We're going to see like Russia deleted as a great power for less money than what Tesla or Facebook will lose in their market capitalization over the course of 2022. Like that's basically like the cost effectiveness of like our current strategy. And part of that current strategy, and obviously like in terms of the US domestic politics, the far left and the far right would have just like lost their minds if like the US actually engaged in conflict. And obviously the nuclear escalation risk would have been insane. But basically Biden believed in Ukraine, Ukrainians believed in themselves, and here we are.
So you mentioned the nuclear escalation. I think, this is one of the main questions on everybody's minds now. So how is NATO going to, and the United States and the EU going to manage the threat of nuclear use that Putin has mentioned a couple of times?
It's great. It's a great question. And so this is like leadership intentions. The better able you're, like, you, me, like the student, the better we're able to understand this question, the long and fruitful careers we'll have. So we can think, first of all, we have messaging directly from the US president and the US National Security Advisor that says nuclear response is unlikely unless a NATO member gets attacked. So we start to identify if NATO gets attacked, but with nuclear weapons, nuclear response, totally an option. But what President Biden and National Security Advisor named Jake Sullivan, so what NSA Sullivan has said and what Biden has said and what the president of France has said and what the head of the European Commission has said, which is one of the EU bodies, is that a nuclear attack on Ukraine is likely to meet a conventional response that will be devastating. Others have, and some of them use the word devastating, others have used the word overwhelming. So what is it that Russia then understands, not just Putin, but the people around him, is that they use a weapon against Ukraine. Will it help them win the war any more effectively, or will it change the course of the war? Maybe not, we can have that discussion. What would it mean to our armies in the field in Ukraine? What would that mean to our Black Sea fleet? What would that mean to our Caspian flotilla, which are all participating in the conflict? Would the United States Navy come in and sink our ships? Would the United States Air Force come in, establish a no-fly zone? Those are all within the extreme realms of possibility, or the realms of extreme possibility. And so Putin and the people around him then have to think, what is our level of power relative to Ukraine and relative to the larger West and relative to China with basically our existing militaries prior to basically, getting attacked by NATO, when basically Ukraine has been able to hold us off and basically retake half of what we took since the war began. NATO is way bigger, way stronger, and people would love to delete Russia's armies in the field, what does our ability to maintain power at home and project power abroad look like if we start to go down this nuclear path? Now, again, they may use it, but they're now aware of the consequences. And that's part of like the deterrence is Russia's going to talk about nuclear weapons every time things on the battlefield look bad. But it doesn't mean that they're going to use it.
So, barring the use of nuclear weapons in the conflict, how long do you think the United States and NATO can maintain the level of support for Ukraine that they have used so far?
In a matter of just like what are like the we can take that question two ways. Like the actual stuff, like years. Political resolve, that has a shorter shelf life. Mm-hmm. That really relies on basically which of two things are coming in, or which of two things are going to like basically continue longer. There's obviously Western support to Ukraine, the Russian economy. The Russian economy maybe has a year left on it before it just like totally collapses. But in essence, the thing that Western support is based on is Western support, like all of us in the US, most importantly, is we love a winner. So long as Ukraine is winning on the battlefield, Ukraine will continue to get support. Will they get the same support as before? No, but that may not be a bad thing because as the conflict changes, they're going to need different things. So it could be that the volume of like artillery goes down, but the types of artillery change. Like, so just like this week, we gave them, so like HIMARS, things of like that nature, that's like 1980s technology. We're starting to give them 1990s and like early 2000s level air defense. So you can start to see that over time, the sophistication of the materials that we give, that goes on. So Western resolve is based on Western political support. Western political support is based on like what the people writ large want. We'll see basically like if, in today's election, for those who haven't voted, go vote. In today's election, the Republicans have a much more skeptical view, not on support to Ukraine. They seem to be in support of that, but they want to know, what are we getting in return? And what basically are the end states of this conflict? And that might be the way that Ukraine starts to think, what are things that we can do to try to win even more quickly so that if we come with a more skeptical US Congress in January, we'll have enough gains locked in order to keep the status quo level support from the US. And so those are the basic issues. Stuff, we got plenty. Western support, as long as Ukraine keeps winning, people will keep supporting them. But as soon as they start losing, that's when we start to see, shouldn't we give peace a chance?
Well, that is actually, I think, a great way to wrap up this talk. A reminder to everyone, today is election day. So if you haven't already, make sure you go out and vote. So thank you so much, Dr. Weber, for spending time with us today for this very interesting presentation. Hopefully we can have you out in person sometime soon. But thank you for coming, and everybody, thank you for your attendance.
Thank you once again. Thank you, Dr. Chapman. Thank you to the team around you. Thank you to everyone who joined in. If you have any questions, comments, please send them along. And thanks, and have a great day.
Thank you all.
Take care. Bye-bye.